In 1900, a diesel engine ran on pure peanut oil in Paris. No diesel fuel, no blend, nothing but crushed peanuts. The French government requested the test, hoping their colonies could grow fuel instead of importing it. The engine ran clean. That detail got erased from almost every fuel history written since. Here is why that matters to you. A cheap hand press can still pull that same oil today, in your own shed, from crops you already grow. Stay with me. Nobody tells you why this idea was buried. That test was not a rumor. It was not a forum post or a YouTube myth passed around like a campfire story. It was a public demonstration, documented, witnessed, written into the official record of the exposition. A government paid for it because they wanted an answer to a real problem. How do you keep machines running in a place with no oil wells and no ports for fuel barges? And the answer they got was, you grow it. Now hold on to that, because here's where it gets strange. Walk into certain Mennonite settlements scattered through northern Mexico, places like the colonies near Chihuahua, built starting in 1922, and you find a culture that never fully accepted the idea that a farm has to depend on someone else's fuel, someone else's grid, someone else's supply chain. These communities built their own blacksmith shops, their own machine shops. They kept tractors running on steel wheels long after the rest of the world switched to rubber, not because they couldn't afford tires, but because steel wheels kept the machine slow, local, and on the community's terms. That's not nostalgia, that's a design choice. A whole philosophy of staying independent built directly into the metal. So here's the question that should be bothering you right now. What does a 100-year-old peanut oil demonstration in Paris have to do with a Mennonite blacksmith shop in northern Mexico? The answer is the same machine used two different ways by two groups of people who both refused to depend on a fuel they did not control. And the device that connects them costs less than a tank of gas. It's called a seed press. Picture something the size of a large flashlight mounted on a frame with a hand crank on one end. Drop sunflower seeds or canola into a hopper at the top. Turn the crank. Inside, a slow turning screw, basically a thick metal worm, drags the seed through a narrowing tube. As the space tightens, the pressure builds. The oil has nowhere to go but out, weeping through tiny slits in the barrel into a cup underneath. What's left over, the dry compressed solid, comes out the other end as cake. And that cake isn't waste. It's livestock feed, packed with protein. Now picture that on your own property. Not a refinery, not an industrial co-op, a shed, a quarter-acre planted in sunflowers or canola, a hand crank you turn while the radio plays, 5 gallons. That's roughly what 20 pounds of seed will give you in an afternoon of pressing, enough to run a small generator, a tiller, an older tractor for days. No pipeline, no station, no bill. That's the entire mechanism. No chemistry set, no catalyst, no reactor, just pressure, applied patiently, doing what a hydraulic press does to grapes. Except this time what comes out isn't wine, it's fuel. If it's really this simple, you have to ask, why isn't this normal already? Why isn't every rural property running a press like this in the back shed? Stay with me, because here's the part that should make you angry. Sunflower seed gives up close to 40% of its weight as oil. Canola gives up nearly a third. That oil, once filtered, is chemically close enough to diesel that Rudolf Diesel, the man whose name is on every diesel engine on Earth, said this himself in writing in 1912, that vegetable oils could become as important to fuel supply as petroleum and coal tar products already were. Not might, not someday maybe. He said it directly, as a man who had already proven it in front of a government audience 12 years earlier. So if the inventor of the diesel engine believed crop oil could rival petroleum, and a government had already tested it successfully, why does almost nobody alive today know this? Why does this sound like a conspiracy instead of common knowledge? In September of 1913, Rudolf Diesel boarded a steamer crossing the English Channel. He had dinner, he went to his cabin, and he was never seen alive again. 10 days later, his body was pulled from the water by a Belgian crew. The official record calls it suicide, pointing to mounting debts and a crossed-out date in his diary. Maybe that's exactly what happened. But notice the timing. The man who had just spent over a decade trying to convince the world that engines didn't need to depend on oil wells disappeared at the exact moment petroleum was tightening its grip on the global economy. Coincidence? Maybe. But the idea he was pushing didn't disappear with him. It went underground. And what happened to it next, the part involving a Belgian patent, a public bus route, and a war that forced an entire country back to crop oil, is the part nobody wants you to find. The patent came first, 1937. A Belgian chemist, Georges Chavin, at the University of Brussels, filed paperwork for a process that turned raw vegetable oil into something that burned even cleaner in a diesel engine. Not a theory, not a sketch on a napkin, a filed, numbered patent. A year later, the proof rolled onto the street. Summer of 1938. A passenger bus began running a real commercial route between Brussels and the university town of Leuven, fueled entirely on palm oil. Not a prototype in a lab. A scheduled bus, paying passengers, a published timetable, burning crop oil instead of diesel. Sit with that for a second. This wasn't a fringe idea cooked up by hobbyists in a barn. This was patented science. This was public transit on a paved road with a printed schedule. And then, almost nothing. No second city adopted it. No standard spread across Europe. The idea that should have multiplied went quiet, right as world events were about to hand it the perfect opportunity. That opportunity came fast. World War II broke nearly every fuel supply chain on Earth. Tankers got sunk. Ports got blockaded. Countries cut off from imported diesel reached almost immediately for the same backup plan diesel had proven decades earlier. Brazil banned cottonseed oil exports so the oil could fuel engines instead of being sold overseas. Other countries did the same with whatever oil crop they had. When the system broke, this was the answer everyone already knew. It wasn't theoretical, it was muscle memory. So ask yourself the obvious question. If crop oil is reliable enough to be the emergency backup plan for entire nations during a world war, why isn't it the everyday plan the rest of the time? Here's the part that stops being a mystery and starts being a pattern. After the war, petroleum got cheap again, fast, abundant, and backed by an industry with every incentive to stay the only option people thought about. Engines got built and tuned around petroleum diesel. The vegetable oil path didn't fail on its own merits. It simply stopped being convenient for the people now controlling the supply. And then, decades later, the door got locked properly, not with a ban, but with paperwork. In 2002, an industry standard called ASTM D6751 defined exactly what counted as legitimate biodiesel. Around the same time, federal rules required any fuel used on public roads to be registered and certified. Standardized biodiesel qualified. Straight pressed oil, the kind a hand crank in your shed produces, did not. Run it on a public road without paying fuel tax, and you are not breaking a safety law. You are breaking a paperwork law. One man in North Carolina learned that the hard way. He was fined $1,000 for running his truck on oil he pressed himself, not because his engine failed, because he had not paid the right tax to the right office. Notice what that really means. The obstruction was never about whether this works. It works. It worked in 1900, in 1938, and during a war that swallowed most of the planet's fuel supply. The obstruction was about who gets to control the meter. Here's the proof that seals it. The one still running right now. In a farming community outside Garalo, Mali, cooperative growers planted jatropha, pressed it themselves on the same kind of screw press you just pictured, and ran it through modified diesel generators to power their own village. Lights, water, machinery, with no outside fuel delivery required. Meanwhile, in Germany, a program built around pure rapeseed oil has put more than 12,000 engines on the road and in the field, running on oil milled at small local presses. One farmer alone presses and burns roughly 150,000 liters of his own crop oil a year in his own equipment. This is not a museum piece. It is happening on a farm right now, on a continent away, with the same machine described to you minutes ago. Bring it back to your own ground. You do not need 12,000 engines or a village cooperative. You need one older diesel, built before computers ran the injectors, a generator, a tiller, a tractor from before everything got sealed shut and digital. Run it on a simple 2-tank setup. Start on regular diesel, let it warm, switch to your own pressed and gently warmed oil once running, switch back before shutdown. That is the whole trick. The leftover cake feeds your animals, the oil runs your equipment. Every gallon you press is a gallon you did not have to drive into town to buy. So here's where it lands. Proven in Paris in 1900, predicted in writing by the inventor himself in 1912, built into a public bus route in 1938, leaned on by entire nations during a world war, then quietly fenced off, not because it failed, but because cheap petroleum and a wall of paperwork made it inconvenient for the people who profited from you not knowing. And still right now, it is running engines in Mali and farms in Germany, and it could just as easily run something in your own shed. That is the kind of person this channel is for. Someone who looks at an old, overlooked machine and asks what it actually does, instead of accepting that it was forgotten for a good reason. So tell me, what is sitting in your shed right now that you did not know could run on something you grew yourself? Because this is not the only system that got quietly fenced off. There is another one, buried even deeper, involving the well in your own backyard, and how a community learned to pull water for free, forever, without a utility bill in sight. That one is next.